Welcome today. Welcome to the presentation. Great to see a lot of familiar faces here again. Um, so today we're here to talk about mezzanines. And when we were looking at different topics we could speak about, one of the things that came up was, hey, look, there's a few changes in mezzanines. How significant are they? How insignificant are they? And when we were actually putting it together, we didn't know if we had enough material to actually put a webinar on just mezzanines. But after going through it all, it's been the last while putting this together. We definitely have enough, and there's actually quite a few kind of changes that have happened, not just with the mezzanine exiting, which we talk about a lot, but also just on accessibility and that. So we'll get into that as well. So with mezzanines, one of the reasons, when you're designing a building, we're just going to talk first about why you would do a mezzanine classification. And a lot of it comes down to actually how the building code is set up in terms of how it interprets, construction requirements being based on the number of stories, for example, in a building. Also, the building code then says, hey, this mezzanine isn't quite at the same level of risk as a story, so it gives you usually a reduced fire resistance or potentially no fire resistance rating. So that would mean, in terms of construction cost, you would be able to not have to maybe put fireproofing on it, so there'd be a cost saving there, but also in terms of visibility, you would be able to look down on the floor below and it wouldn't necessarily trigger the interconnected floor space requirements. And another area is on exiting. There's actually reduced exiting from mezzanines, provided it actually meets the mezzanine requirements. These have changed from the previous OBC. So that's where a lot of the focus is on today for designers to understand what that means and what that means for their designs. So when we get into it, we talk about, we give an example. This is an example of why we would do a mezzanine classification over a story. This is an example of an assembly building. We have the first story, we have a mezzanine because it meets the 40% requirement. You can view down to the floor below, and we have the second story. So this allows, it still has 3 levels in the building in terms of floor levels. However, one of them is a mezzanine, the other 2 are stories. So it's technically a 2-story building. So when you look at this, what would the benefits be from the building code perspective, or how you assess this building? First of all, gives you an example of the construction requirements. So under 32226, if this is a 2-story building, you get the option of making it of combustible or non-combustible materials. So that would free up your ability to use whatever you want. There is a limitation on the floor area. However, in the actual floor areas themselves, on the floor assembly themselves, the floor assembly only requires a fire resistance rating if it's combustible. So if you made this out of concrete or steel, it wouldn't need a fire resistance rating, and the same for the mezzanine. So there's a potential cost saving there in terms of how you actually construct the building. Whereas if you go ahead and just say that mezzanine level was actually classified as a story, it would put us into 32224, which would mean we'd have to do non-combustible. It might be okay, it might be doing that anyway. And the floors would go up to 1 hour, and the mezzanine would also go up to 1 hour. So it's an increase in the fire resistance rating. Also, within this, it gives us the when we talk about this, we talk about the interconnected floor space. So if you have a floor area like this, and we've talked about interconnected floor spaces in different presentations, one of the things that can happen is if you have more than 2 floors open to each other, you'd actually trigger the interconnected floor space requirements. And in the new OBC, that would be quite significant if these were considered as stories. If this one, for example, was considered a story and not as a mezzanine. So then you'd end up with having to do all the protection of the stairwells and all the different things we've talked about in that presentation. It's available on YouTube if anyone wants to go back and look at those, but that's an example of why, as designers and as builders and as people putting these buildings together, why we would actually go and try and classify an area as a mezzanine. Okay, so we talked about the pros and cons. The pros are the reduced fire rating, the permitted combustible, non-combustible construction, and then the interconnected floor space protection. You could potentially get rid of those or reduce those. But the cons are we are limited in areas. 40% for open mezzanines, which we'll get into, and 10% for enclosed. And one of the key things, you actually have to be able to see the floor area below. So there are limitations on what we can do, but it does have some upside. We'd often see these in, for example, restaurants, mezzanine levels in restaurants, You can add it into a building without or put into a building without increasing the height of the building in terms of number of stories. Very common in industrial applications where you may have office areas that are a subsidiary to the industrial space that actually don't trigger the requirement to be a story in building height as well. Okay, so with that, we're only 8 minutes in, but Tiffany, can you run the first poll on this? So the first poll question is, what are the main benefits of classifying an area as a mezzanine? So there's 4 options: reduced construction requirements, potential reduced exiting requirements, doesn't count as a story in building height, all of the above. So please choose the most correct answer. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. And Tiffany, if you can let us know how we're doing.
All right, folks, please complete that poll on your screen. Right now, it looks like the answer with the most responses is at 88%. We have all of the above.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, very smart group here today. Okay, so what is a mezzanine? We just want to, some of these definitions, we just want to try and talk about them before we get into some of the nuts and bolts of the changes. And for anyone, maybe there's some young designers or new designers new to the industry on here as well, who we'd want to talk to. I'll just explain what this is. So essentially a mezzanine is an intermediate floor between a floor and a ceiling. It's located in a story. It doesn't create a new story. So it's that floor level. And this image kind of gives you an example of what we could often see as a mezzanine. It's that intermediate floor in between the floor and the ceiling of a story. So when we say floor area, this is important because when we get to the definitions and when we get to the how we measure floor area is actually the perimeter of a building. Okay, so it's between the exterior space of the whole perimeter of a building. So when we talk, there are some, for example, in some mezzanines we base it on floor area. In other ones we base it on the size of a room. So this is one to be aware of. It's the whole perimeter of a building. The next one is in terms of suites. Suites comes up as well, so we want to talk about suites. Suite is, if this is an example of, say, I'm going to say like a whole group of offices or a strip mall situation where we have each one of these is an individual suite, because there are limitations on how we can arrange suites with the mezzanine requirements as well. So this is just some of the background, so that allows us to kick on and talk about the actual mezzanines themselves. So it comes down to 2 key things. There are open mezzanines and closed mezzanines. So, for example, an open mezzanine is 40% of the room it's located in. A closed mezzanine is 10% of the suite. So that's that could potentially be the whole floor area of a building. For example, if you have a large industrial building, it's 1 tenant, 1 suite. So they will get the whole 10% from the whole suite, whereas the open area is actually the room it's located in. So this is the part of the code that addresses mezzanine. It's 3211, and it talks about open mezzanines. There have been some minor nuance changes within this in terms of the wording between the 2012 OBC and then 2024 OBC. However, fundamentally, there is not actually a change in how it's applied. It's the same application in terms of how we assess open mezzanine or enclosed mezzanine. And it talks about, for example, an open mezzanine, it's the aggregate area, so you can have more than 1 mezzanine in a room that's not superimposed, does not exceed 40% of the open area of the room in which it's located. This is very important for open mezzanines, to understand that it's the open area of the room they're located in, it's not the entire building. The other one is that you can't have any obstructions that are more than 1070, so that matches up with the height of a guard. Between the floor area of the mezzanine and the floor area below. So that's one of the restrictions on this, is when you want to do an open mezzanine, you have to be able to see the floor area below. So this gives you an example of what a mezzanine would look like. You're standing on the level above, you're able to freely see down and you understand what's happening. And this is part of the code allowance to do this, is where you can you fully see what's going on. If something happens on the floor area below, you're made aware of it very, very quickly, and you're able to egress off that mezzanine. So this is 40% of the area of the room. So this is when we talk about having multiple mezzanines. You're actually allowed to have more than one mezzanine within that room. However, the total can't go over 40 still. It's still limited to 40, but it would be based on that room alone, not on the not you can have 10 mezzanines, you have one big one, do whatever you want, just can't go over that 40%, and they have to be open. So then we get down to the closed mezzanines. So these are they're a small bit easier in terms of construction because it's you're allowed to have walls. However, you're not allowed to exceed 10% of the floor area of the suite. So it's the same thing again, the aggregate area of the sorry, go back here. The aggregate area of the mezzanines. So you can have more than one closed mezzanine, not superimposed, does not exceed 10% of the floor area in which it's located. So this goes back to the floor area, which I mentioned. For example, if you had a large industrial building, you could take the whole, 10,000 square meters, take 10% of that. Now that would trigger another issue, which we'll go into. But the other one is the area of the mezzanine is suite. So two things: if you have more than one suite, it still doesn't allow you to take all the area from the other parts. It still can't exceed 10% of the suite. So this would be an example of a closed mezzanine, and the reduction in area would correspond with the reduction in actual visibility. So the code would say, hey, you can see down, still only 10%, still not as risky as different thing as having a full story. So we're going to give you some dispensations. However, you're only going to get 10% of the floor area because you can't see down. And then we get into this example, which is the situation where you have multiple suites. And we've dealt with this a number of times where you might have individual tenants in say, retail or in office spaces, some of the condominium offices, things like that. And they would come to us and say, hey, I want to put a mezzanine in. No one else in the whole block has a mezzanine. Can I have, the 10% of the whole area? And we're like, no, unfortunately, you can't. It's still limited to 10% of the suite in which you're located. You have to follow that. So this is where it comes in. You can have one in every single unit, just no individual unit. And it also allows for, in the future, if anyone comes in or out, that they're not limited by their own by something being taken by another unit. This is the same example for our large industrial buildings. We mentioned that in the large industrial buildings, if you've only one tenant, it would be 10% of the floor area. So this could be a situation where throughout the building, you might have different supervisory offices, for example, over some of the production space. You might have even service rooms, different things, or other space. So they can't exceed 10% of that floor area, but it's based on the entire footprint of the entire building. Okay, just one thing, when we talk about superimposed mezzanines, you can't do one mezzanine above another mezzanine. In this situation, the mezzanine above would be considered as a story, or one of them would definitely be considered, this one would be considered as a story, because you can't do one above another. It doesn't allow you to tier them up that way. So let's just be careful with that. I don't think I've ever seen anyone try to do it, but it's in the code that says someone must have tried to do it because it's in the code. Okay, Tiffany, can you run poll number 2? So this question, guys, goes back to some of the fundamentals of what a mezzanine is. If a floor area has full height walls, so floor to ceiling, and is more than 10% of the area of the suite in which it is located, can it be classified as a mezzanine?
All right, folks, if you can please submit your answer using the poll. Just giving it another couple of seconds here. Right now, the strong winner is sitting at 86% no.
Okay, very good. Okay, so we're going to get into it now. So what has changed with the OBC? As we've mentioned in all the previous or many of the previous sessions we've had on changes to the Ontario Building Code, a lot of the changes are about harmonizing the Ontario Building Code with the National Building Code of Canada. For a long time, we had many made in Ontario specials, different things that address different things or were left over from previous codes. So what's happened is that the harmonization has happened. We've taken all the national building code requirements. However, they're a bit in terms of what we do from time to time, they're a bit different from what we did before. So we have to kind of adjust. We've had to adjust with some of the other requirements that we've run through already on interconnected floor spaces and things like that. And this is one where we've got a little adjustment to make as well. So one of the key changes, this was brought up in the interconnected floor space discussion as well, was on the actual new requirement that says that if you go over 500 square meters in a mezzanine, you have to enclose it. Okay. So where this could impact you is if you were planning to do a mezzanine, for example, a open mezzanine, but next thing you hit 600 square meters, it doesn't matter. You have to enclose it. That sends you back into a loop where now you don't have the view to the floor below. So you actually don't meet the open requirement and you're back in an enclosed requirement. So it's just something to remember that once you hit 500, you have to stay under that to not have to enclose it. So you could end up triggering some of the requirements to actually be a floor or a story in building height if you go over this area. So it's something to be aware of. There's also been a few modifications within this section where they just simply removed some of the sections and they actually simplified it. In some ways, the actual previous OBC, the 2012, actually didn't make a lot of sense in terms of it linked you back, but to some other provisions, but they didn't actually match the National Building Code of Canada. So there was a small bit of a gap there. But this is the change in terms of if you go over this size at 500 square meters, you will trigger a fire separation, which will take away your visibility. This actually comes up later on when we talk about how to classify a floor area and what can happen with it. So this is the example. Under 500 square meters, you're fine. You're good to go as an open mezzanine. Over 500, no matter what you do, you still have to enclose it. So this would come up mainly. This size of mezzanine would probably only be seen in industrial applications. We don't come across too many of these in other office or in assembly buildings. So that's the impact for designers. So we get into this is where the main changes actually happen. So this is in 3422. I put the previous OBC and the new OBC beside each other just so we can get some understanding of some of the changes. In terms of how it looks at this, the code, they've changed the wording of this sentence 1, but there is actually no particular fundamental change in this sentence. And what they both pretty much say is that if you have a mezzanine, the mezzanine should be provided with exits the same as a story, unless it meets any of the exemptions. So it's like follow the standard floor area or story requirements unless you meet the exemptions. So, for example, this is what it would look like. No matter what size your mezzanine, the starting point would say, hey, you need 2 exits. You need to meet travel distance, all that. You measure travel distance to the exit door as typical standard requirements for this. That's your starting point, and then you start to peel back that depending if you meet the exemptions or not. So the next one, this sentence 2 is just got this. It's actually taken out. This was the exemption before that said about it actually waived sentence 1, and it's gone out of the new code. And that was the previous code said mezzanine need not conform to sentence 1 provided it does not require to terminate a vertical fire separation. However, when you went back to the vertical fire separation, it didn't have the 500 square meter limit. It only had the 40% and 10%. So this is actually this has gone out of the code. So it's a bit of a change in terms of how we do it, but it is what it is. So we're going to move on with it. In terms of this is the biggest section that addresses exiting, and this is 322 sentence 2. So within this, it talks about one of the exemptions of the means of egress, and we're going to go through them one by one. There's the actual area, which we just mentioned. There's the occupant load, the actual area of the mezzanine, travel distances, and how we measure those travel distances. For this example, the means of egress for the mezzanine need not conform with sentence 1, provided the mezzanine is not required to terminate a vertical fire separation. So we're going to assume our mezzanine is under 500 square meters, which we've discussed. The second one is, this is a bigger one. This is a new one. If you go over 60 people, you don't get the exemption. Unless there's an exemption further on, but at 60 people, you can't just use the open staircase like we were able to use them before. You have to actually go ahead, and there will be at least one exit on the floor area. The next one is in the actual size of a mezzanine. So you'll see this. This is a reference to the table 3422. So a means of egress is allowed to have reduced exiting. For example, it's allowed to use the open staircases to exiting, provided it meets the area limitations of table 3422. This table, in my opinion, is very, very restrictive. It's the actual areas in this, by the way, they match up with what we'd be allowed to have in an unsprinklered room. They're the same size areas. So, for example, an assembly space of 150 square meters, that's actually only 15 by 10 meters. It's not a very big space. Might be okay in some small infill off restaurants, but in the bigger scale things, it's not a lot of space. Residential, we don't typically see many mezzanines anyway. Business, we might see them more often at 200 square meters. So that's quite a small area as well. And if you think of, we talk about the large industrial application, and that would be very easily eaten up at 200 square meters, 2,000 square feet. Mercantile as well. The mercantile might be okay if it's smaller units, but in bigger units, the same. And then the industrial applications as well. Typically, when we work on large industrial buildings, they're much, much bigger than this, and therefore would not meet the provisions to be allowed to have reduced exiting. So that's one thing. That's one area. The second area is in the travel distance. So within the travel distance, it's the same thing again. They've given us new limitations on the travel distance. The limitations, again, in my opinion, are incredibly restrictive. 15 meters is very, very short, especially if you think, we go back to the restaurant example. Take a restaurant and you have 15 meters will get eaten up pretty quickly once you start going around tables and obstructions. Residential, not so much. Same with office, 25 meters is also not so bad for office, but it's still pretty short. And anyone 15, 10, like 10 in a medium hazard industrial. Most manufacturing facilities, for example, would probably go into medium hazard if they're dealing with plastics or things like that. So they'd be in that. So your distance is very, very short in those. So you're really going to trigger having to have to go and actually put in some exiting in terms of more like a floor area and not the reduced requirements we would have seen before. So then we get into how we actually measure in these situations. So we go back to this the measurement of how we treat the distance out of the space. This talks about when you only have one door from the floor area. So if you've got a mezzanine within a room with one door, remember I mentioned that if, for example, if you're in assembly space, you only have 15 meters. So now, based on only having one door, you only have 15 meters from the back here across, down, and out of the space. So that's not going to probably get us out of the space. Realistically, most mezzanines we would deal with would be a lot bigger than that. Unless you were bringing people down the back and sending them out the back, you might be okay. But in general, this would be very, very tight for us in terms of most of the types of buildings we would see. So that's a very restrictive requirement as well. So typically then you'd end up with a situation where you're allowed to actually measure to the top of the staircase, which is what we would have done before. So we're allowed to measure to the top of the stairs, but we're still, we have our two doors now, so that's better, a bit better. It gives us options to go left and right or two directions of travel once we come down. But that does help, but it just means you have to have at least two exits from the room in which the in which the mezzanine is located. Realistically, if we're going over 60 people, we're going to need that in the room anyway, which probably in an assembly space we're gone over. So maybe it's not that big of a deal, but it's just something to remember. Maybe in office spaces, it's not quite as clear cut in terms of that area and having those second means of egress. This gives you an example. if we're dealing with a very restrictive travel distance, such as assembly occupancies, you may end up having to add a second open stair. Now you're still limited to 60 people, but this would help you meet the travel distance, and would also allow you to have, to get the area get a bit bigger and meet the egress requirements out of the space. Okay, so if you don't meet those, and therefore kind of smaller occupant loads, less than 60 or 60 people or less, travel distance are very restricted, what can you do? So the code hasn't gone full hog and said, hey, you need all the exits. It does allow some provisions. So it says at least half of the required means of egress from a mezzanine shall comply with one if the mezzanine is not required to terminate a fire separation. So this is under 500 square meters. We talked about linking back to this, that it didn't previously link back before. So we have to keep our mezzanine under 500 square meters. For example, this will be how that will be arranged. We'd have a less than 500 square meter mezzanine. We have one exit stairs that's actually serving the mezzanine level. And then we would have the other staircase, could be an open staircase to the floor area below. The big benefit of this is it meets the requirement for one of the exemptions. It's only one exit, it's not two exits. But it would also it would allow us to go down and meet the travel distance based on the exit on the floor area. So this would help us on this, and we wouldn't be restricted by the shorter travel distances here. We'd be back to the 45-meter travel distance. We wouldn't be doing the much reduced 15-meter travel distance. So that could help us a lot. You'd have to meet that 45 meters to an exit on either this floor or the floor area below. So this is an example if you were in a larger industrial building, where we would have, if we had a mezzanine that now exceeded 500 square meters. Okay, it's still a mezzanine. Okay, so for example, if you were doing 10% enclosed in mezzanine and the floor area is 10,000 square meters, that means 10% of that is 1,000. We have a mezzanine, say 600 square meters. We have to enclose that mezzanine anyway, but we still have a fire separation there. We can't use a convenience stair as part of the means of egress. We have to provide two exits on that floor area on the basis of it being the size of the mezzanine being required to have two exits. So it's back to, when you get to this situation, the only real benefit of calling it a mezzanine will be back to the construction requirements, because the construction requirements would still be a two-story building, for example, even if you had a floor above it, or it might be a one-story building. So that would be the benefit of it. But in terms of exiting, it's back to looking like a normal floor or a normal story. So it's not a huge amount of additional benefit on this one. So just on this, I just want to talk about, I'm going to go into accessibility in a second. But one thing that comes up that I should have probably put a slide together on is, this is all well and good if you're putting your mezzanines around the edges of a building. We deal with, say, certain manufacturing facilities, large, I think of a few large ones down around Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge area, where we've done alternative solutions and had to look at different things with the mezzanines in the middle of the actual building. So with the new code change, this is actually going to make some of those mezzanines quite difficult, or they're going to have to be subject to an alternative solution. Because if you have to introduce an exit because of the area, we could easily, in an industrial application, go over the 10-meter travel distance or go over the areas. We're now required to have an exit stair. And if you took that exit stair and had to put it right in the middle of here of this building, due to the process or just how the building's arranged, you're not going to be able to get this exit stairs, down to ground. You're not going to be realistically building a exit corridor the whole way across the ground floor. You'd end up cutting all the process in half. So that's one area where we see kind of this one is a bit more challenging in meeting. But that's why the code is an objective-based code, and it would look at the actual given the scenario you have in that, and you might be able to justify an alternative solution that maybe obviously subject to approval by the city or the building department. But that's one where we potentially see there will be some challenges with the change and how the actual mandatory exit when you go over a certain area. So one of the other code changes that's happened is the change to accessibility. there's always been some exemptions for mechanical space and service spaces and things like that. But one of the new ones is this 3821 sentence M. And with this sentence M, I'm going to just go to it here and just show you. It talks about when you need to provide barrier-free access to a floor level. Okay. So, for example, in a building, if you're a mezzanine, and on that mezzanine you had service space, would likely be exempted. You wouldn't have to provide an elevator to it. However, on the same facet, if you had a mezzanine and the washrooms for all the staff were on that level, yes, that mezzanine would have to be barrier free. Or if it obviously goes over 600 square meters, or if there's any facilities up there that would be needed that are not provided somewhere else in the building that is barrier free. So this is a 3821 sentence M. There are a lot of nuances to this, and you have to give consideration to how it's actually being used. And is there anything up there that would not be available on the floor area below to people like staff or to people working in the building or visitors or whoever is in the building? You shouldn't have anything up there that is that would reduce the level of what's available to people on that floor. And I think honestly the appendix note, I'm really happy with the appendix note they had it into this. Now, an appendix note is not the part of the code. It's not actually a mandatory part of the code. They're put there to help us understand it. But this one I feel has done a pretty good job at saying, hey, we don't have to put an elevator to every mezzanine. For example, it talks about mezzanines in here as long as they're not over 600 square meters. 100 square meters if it's assembly. So in the restaurants, you get less, or in assembly spaces. And it goes through why you'd be allowed to do it. For example, for small offices in the second story or small restaurants. And that's the concept. And it goes into actually further on explain if the restaurant only serves the washrooms. It talks about basements, but in general, like lunchrooms, things like that. So it's one area where I feel like the code has done a bit of an update on this, and it's one to be watching out for when you're doing your designs, because we often get people coming to us and say, hey, do I have to provide an elevator to a mezzanine? It's not a story. And our answer would be, well, it's not exempted unless it meets these criteria. And there was a lot of ambiguity in the previous code about some of these like smaller office spaces or smaller areas. So this is the one where I feel like the code has done a pretty good job at updating this and providing clarity around what the actual intent of this is and what the code actually wants us to do. So this is just some examples. If if essential facilities, washroom, staff rooms are located on the other floor, they must have a barrier-free path of travel. And the examples are a small office with workstations upstairs, up on the upper floor. You might actually be exempted if you have all the facilities on the ground floor, other offices, lunchroom, all that, washrooms, all the different things. And you didn't have meeting rooms and things like that up there. Same at a restaurant. If you had some additional seating on a mezzanine, you may also be exempted, provided everything was on the ground floor and barrier-free. Just one thing on this, the code does say that a barrier-free path of travel has to extend around the entire ground floor of a building. The actual appendix note confirms that that was not intended to apply to mezzanines within that floor. Obviously, this still has to meet the functionality requirements I've been talking about, but that's one of the areas where the code has provided some clarification. The other one would be where it would not be exempt. A restaurant would have washrooms on the mezzanine, same thing, would not be exempt. And staff lunchrooms, employee facilities on the mezzanine, same thing, not exempt. So these are some of the examples. It's in terms of like questions about this, it's very hard to be generic about it. You really have to look at what exactly is happening and where everything else is. But there is some more leeway in terms of making some of these mezzanines barrier free. Now that said, if you have an elevator in the building and it does stop at the mezzanine level, it is required to be barrier free. So it's not like you can put washrooms up there when you have elevator access and then not make them accessible. That's not the intent of this. But if you don't have an elevator, this is when it would waive the barrier-free requirements. Okay, so that's the end of this presentation. Just a few reminders for people. All this presentation, all our previous presentations are available on YouTube. We've them uploaded there to our channel. So if anyone wants to go and watch them, or if you have any colleagues or staff members that are interested in some of these code changes, please go ahead and have a look at those. One of the future ones we'll probably be running or will be running is the what we're very, very busy on these days is CMHC accessibility. So that's for the funding, the various funding models. A lot of different projects have different funding. So different requirements. It might be CSA, it might be it might be Rick Hansen. We've all the team in place for that. So depending on what it is, so that's one of the ones we'll be looking at and just probably taking people through some of the suite design challenges we have, or how we, some of the layouts. We're obviously kind of a year into it now with doing a lot of this, so we have a lot of kind of experience built up on, hey, how would be more efficient with it. Then the other one that's changed and will be coming into effect soon is the Ontario Fire Code. So we will do some sessions on that as well. I think most of our group here today are mainly architects and that side of it, so probably not as much, but it will come up mainly for the building users and that afterwards. And we'd also encourage you, if you've anything you say, hey, I really love a presentation on this. We obviously don't know what we don't know. So if you want to go ahead and suggest something, please do. You can do it in the survey afterwards, or feel free to ping myself or Tiffany a message, and we'll certainly look into it. And just want to update our spatial separation calculators, which are usually very popular on our website, are back up and running. We had a small issue with one of them spitting out the wrong results in unsprinkled buildings for some reason, but we fixed it. So yeah, they're back up and running. And if anyone wants to anything else on that front as well, please let us know. So with that, I'll open up and just see if we have any questions. Tiffany, is there any questions in?
Let me take a peek here. There is one question sitting in the QA/QC. So QA form, it is, what if you're permitted to have one open egress only from the mezzanine if we satisfy all the other exemptions? How do we apply 3
Yeah, so I should have probably went back on this slide. I was gonna, there's an or state, there's an or and an and statement. Here it is. So you can there's two ways the code being looked at. There's different requirements of or and. So you can look at these and say that basically if you meet one or the other. So if you meet one requirement, so if you meet the requirement to be allowed to have a single egress, that then waives you from the second requirement. It says you have to meet either of those requirements, not both of them. So if you don't meet, so the code starts out, sorry, I'll go back a step. The code starts out and says you need 2 exits, for example. Then it says you're allowed to waive it if it's for example, a small mezzanine with less than 60 people, and you meet all the travel distance. If you don't meet that, you're now kicked into sentence 3, which is the permission to have 1 exit stair and 1 open means of egress, provided it's not more than 500 square meters. And then if you don't meet the 500 square meters, you're into 2 exits, the same as the story. But it allows you, basically, this is the example of how the code changes risk level, and it adds different requirements as it increases, as the size of the mezzanine increases. Okay. Any other questions from anyone? That's the only question in the Q&A right now.
There was a question in the chat asking.
I'm just looking at the chat. So yeah, just a few questions. Yes, the presentation will be made available. No, it doesn't have to require the enclosed exit if you meet all the exemptions of 2. If you meet all the exemptions of 2, you still don't have to do the first one. So. Just on the 500 square meter requirement, the 500 square meter requirement was there, but it was also waived by the other requirement. That was the difference that happened, was the change in the waiving of it. Presentation available. Could we have a mezzanine calculator? I don't think we need one. It's 10% to 40%. It's a fairly easy calculation. We don't use it ourselves to just do it together. But yeah, if we think it's something that would be beneficial to the design community, we're certainly happy to look into it. See if there's any more in the chat. Yeah, presentation. Yeah, okay. So if there's any questions, guys, Pavel, I'll follow up with you on the 500 square meters as well. If there's any other questions from anyone, please feel free to get in touch with us. As always, you can email me or send us a message on LinkedIn. And yeah, and if you have any other questions, please let us know. And if unless anything pops into the chat, we will conclude the presentation. Okay, there's one question here. Sorry, it's on 40% of the open space. It's 40% of Oh yeah, so Gordana, yeah, there's a mistake in the building code. It has two sentence twos. I believe they've updated that. It's an editorial error. You'll see there's sentence one and one here. That's actually straight from the building code. It's actually wrong in the building code. I meant to edit it out, but it's here one and one is incorrect in the building code. It's the way it's written. There's a few little things in the building code like this. I think it came out very, very fast. So there was an odd one here and there. Okay, and yeah, Bernardo, if you want to just pop your question into the chat there, we can have a look at it. Okay, thanks everyone.